The dishwasher crossed the ballroom before anyone could stop him. 12 billionaires were laughing over a $2.8 billion deal when Darius Whitmore suddenly grabbed female chief executive Celeste Harrington by the shoulders and ripped her away from the table. Security rushed forward. Guests shouted. Celeste raised her hand to slap him, and then the man beside her dropped face first onto his plate. A second guest collapsed, then a third. Within 40 seconds, 12 people were lying motionless around the woman who ran one of the largest investment firms in the country. Darius stared at the untouched silver spoon in her hand and whispered that she should not eat anything because they had exactly 6 minutes. Stay until the end, because the reason a dishwasher recognized the danger before anyone else in that room will change how every person there sees him forever. The Bellwether Grand had hosted galas before, but nothing quite like the private dinner arranged for 24 of the most powerful financiers and executives in Chicago. At the center of the evening sat a merger worth $2.8 billion a deal that would bind Harrington Meridian Group to Crowley Agricultural Holdings and reshape an entire sector of the market before the sun rose. Celeste Harrington walked into the ballroom in a tailored black suit. No bodyguard pressed against her side, and yet the crowd parted for her, the way water parts for a blade. Grant Mercer, her chief operating officer, hovered close, reminding her twice within the first 10 minutes that the paperwork needed her signature before midnight. Vincent Crowley, the man on the other side of the table, raised his glass early and often, already toasting to a future that had not yet been signed into existence. Nobody in that glittering room noticed the quiet man, 3 floors below them, moving between steel sinks and stacks of porcelain, as if the two worlds did not share the same building. In the basement kitchen, Darius Whitmore worked through hundreds of plates, with the steady rhythm of a man who had done this exact motion 10,000 times before. Rebecca Sloan, the general manager of the Bellwether Grand, had made it clear at the start of the night that nobody from the dish station was permitted anywhere near the ballroom floor. Darius never argued. He simply nodded, took his place at the sink, and let the water run over his hands, while the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses drifted faintly through the ceiling above him. He worked fast, precise, almost mechanical, but one of the line cooks had noticed something strange about him months earlier, a habit nobody could quite explain. Darius smelled the dish towels before folding them. He watched the color of the rinse water longer than necessary. He checked the steam rising off returned plates, and he always glanced at the clock the moment food came back from a table. Nobody understood why a dishwasher cared about details like that, and for a long time, nobody bothered to ask. The kitchen staff had long since stopped questioning his habits, chalking them up to eccentricity rather than anything worth examining. A few of the younger cooks even joked quietly among themselves that Darius behaved more like a scientist than a man paid to scrub burnt sauce off copper pans. None of them knew that his careful attention to smell, color, and timing had once been the exact set of skills that made him one of the most respected investigators in his field. They only saw a quiet man in a stained apron who never complained, never rushed, and never seemed to want anything more than the sink in front of him. When the first tray of dishes came down from the ballroom that night, Darius stopped mid-motion, his hands still dripping over the sink. 3 of the plates had food left untouched on them, which was not unusual on its own. But the pale cream-colored sauce pooled at the edges, caught his eye in a way that made his jaw tighten. He looked at the water glasses next. Most of them drained nearly empty, far more empty than a room of people still an hour from their entree should have left them. He asked the server carrying the tray how long the appetizer course had been out on the tables. The server answered, without much thought, saying it had been about 17 minutes. Darius asked if any guest had mentioned a metallic taste in their mouth, and the server laughed, telling him that he was a dishwasher, not a waiter, and had no business asking questions like that. Darius did not argue with him either. He glanced at the clock mounted above the exit door, 8:43 in the evening, and something old stirred in his chest, a feeling he had spent years trying to bury under soap and steam and silence. He pulled off his gloves, set them on the counter, and turned toward the swinging doors that led out of the kitchen. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, meant for no one but himself. "Stop serving the main course," he said. Nobody heard him. The kitchen kept moving around him exactly as it always did, indifferent, loud, unaware that a warning had just been spoken into the noise and lost. He crossed instead into the food preparation station, where the head chef immediately barked at him to return to the sink where he belonged. Darius ignored the order and asked 3 quick questions, instead wanting to know what time the garnish vegetables had been delivered, who had restocked the ice bin at the East Bar, and how many guests had requested extra water in the last 10 minutes. Nobody could answer all 3 completely, and the gaps in their answers told him almost as much as a full response would have. He noticed a young server standing near the pass, his fingers trembling faintly as he arranged a row of glasses. Darius asked the young man quietly if his lips felt numb, and the server went pale and silent, almost instantly confirming without a single word that something was already wrong. Darius told him to sit down immediately, and for once the server obeyed without protest. Rebecca arrived moments later, furious that a member of the dish crew had wandered into her kitchen's most sensitive station during the most important night of the season. She accused Darius of trying to spread panic among the staff on the very evening the hotel could least afford it. Darius calmly listed the 3 warning signs he had noticed: unusual thirst, a metallic taste, and numbness at the lips, explaining that together they formed a pattern he had seen before. Rebecca cut him off, snapping that he was not a doctor and had no authority to make declarations like that inside her kitchen. Darius answered without raising his voice, saying simply that he had never claimed to be one. The calmness of his response only made Rebecca angrier, and she ordered security to escort him out of the kitchen, entirely her patience for his interruptions completely spent. But before the guards could reach him, another tray arrived from upstairs, and Darius's attention snapped immediately to a single silver spoon resting among the returned dishes. A faint discoloration ran along the surface of the spoon, barely visible unless someone knew exactly what to look for. Darius grabbed a clean white towel and wiped the metal, holding it close, studying the smear left behind, then lifting it to his nose. His expression changed the instant he caught the scent, and he looked up at the clock one more time. 8:46 in the evening. He asked which table the tray had come from, and the server answered that it belonged to the center table, the one where Celeste Harrington was seated. Darius did not wait for Rebecca's permission, and did not wait for security to reach him. He simply ran. Rebecca shouted for the guards to stop him, her voice cracking with a mixture of fury and disbelief. But by the time her words left her mouth, Darius had already shoved through the swinging doors that separated the service corridor from the ballroom floor. The contrast between the 2 worlds hit like a wall of light, and sound crystal chandeliers throwing gold across the room, bottles of wine that cost more than a month of his wages, and conversations circling numbers so large they had stopped sounding like real money to the people speaking them. Vincent Crowley stood near the head of the table, with his glass raised again mid-toast, while Grant slid a stack of finalized documents in front of Celeste, urging her to review the last page before the ink went down. Celeste lifted a small silver spoon toward her mouth, the final bite of her appetizer, the same course that had left 3 untouched plates and a trembling server 30 feet below in the kitchen. Darius saw the spoon rising and understood with a certainty that chilled him exactly how little time remained. "Put it down," he shouted, the words tearing through the polished quiet of the ballroom like a gunshot. Every head turned toward him at once, silverware frozen mid-air, conversations dying mid-sentence. Celeste turned first, startled, confused by the sight of a stranger in a kitchen uniform sprinting toward her table with an urgency that made no sense in a room built entirely for composure. 2 security guards began moving, cutting across the floor to intercept him, but Darius reached her before they could close the distance. He grabbed her by both shoulders and pulled her hard away from her chair, the spoon slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the marble floor. Celeste's shock turned instantly to fury, and Grant's voice rose above the growing chaos, demanding that Darius take his hands off her immediately. Celeste raised her palm, an instinctive reflex, ready to strike the man who had just seized her in front of every major investor in the room. But before her hand could land, Vincent Crowley collapsed face first onto the table beside her, his glass shattering against the polished wood. The room fell into stunned silence for exactly 1 heartbeat before the screaming began. A female finance director slid off her chair and onto the floor. A third guest clutched his throat, gasping. A fourth could no longer hold himself upright, and within 40 seconds, 12 guests lay scattered across the ballroom floor, motionless or convulsing, while the remaining dozen stood frozen in horror. Dr. Nolan Pierce, a medical advisor seated near the far end of the table, rushed forward, kneeling beside the nearest body, his hands moving quickly, but without clear direction. Panic swept through the room, guests scrambling toward the exits, chairs toppling, glasses shattering underfoot. Darius shouted that nobody was permitted to leave, his voice cutting through the chaos with an authority nobody in that room had ever heard from a member of the hotel's kitchen staff. Grant immediately accused Darius of causing the collapse himself, pointing at him as security moved to restrain him. Celeste stood in the middle of the ballroom, her face drained of color, staring at the 12 bodies scattered around her own chair. Darius kept his eyes on the spoon lying at her feet. "You never swallowed," he told her, his voice quieter now, but no less urgent. Celeste asked him, almost breathless, how he could possibly know what was happening. Darius looked past her at the 12 people on the floor, then checked his watch one final time before answering. "They have exactly 6 minutes before their lungs begin shutting down," he said, and the words landed in the room like a verdict nobody wanted to hear. Dr. Nolan immediately objected, insisting that everyone step back and let him work without interference from a stranger in a service uniform. Darius asked him calmly why 12 people seated across different parts of the same section had developed identical symptoms within seconds of one another. Nolan had no answer ready. Darius pointed out that all 12 had been seated in the same cluster of tables, that all 12 had eaten the same garnish, but that their drinks had varied wildly from wine to spirits to sparkling water. The common thread was not the alcohol. It was not the meat course either. Darius asked Nolan to check the guests' pupils and their breathing rate, and the doctor, despite his irritation, complied. What Nolan found silenced him completely. Darius issued a rapid series of instructions, telling the staff to open the secondary ventilation vents, shut down the air circulation system, serving the eastern section of the room, keep every affected guest lying on their side, withhold all fluids, and preserve every plate and utensil exactly where it sat. Rebecca screamed that Darius had no authority to give orders inside her hotel. Celeste, watching a man beside her struggle for breath, turned toward Rebecca with a coldness that ended the argument instantly. "Tonight he does," she said, and it was the first time in her career that she had placed her trust entirely in someone without a title. Darius moved from guest to guest, checking each one individually, sorting the 12 into groups based on how early their symptoms had appeared. He told Nolan that the first group needed attention immediately before the others because their exposure had likely come earliest. An ambulance crew was still 9 minutes away, and Darius made it clear they did not have 9 minutes to spare. He asked for the hotel's emergency response kit, and Rebecca insisted no such equipment existed anywhere in the building. Darius looked directly at her and told her it did down on level B2 inside a red cabinet behind the third backup generator. Rebecca stood frozen, unable to explain how a dishwasher knew the layout of her hotel's emergency systems better than she did. Celeste began to understand in that moment that Darius held knowledge of the Bellwether Grand's crisis infrastructure that far exceeded anything expected of kitchen staff. With Nolan's help, Darius stabilized the breathing of the most critical patients, monitoring their pulses and repositioning them as the minutes ticked away. When the paramedics finally arrived, Nolan read off Darius's observations aloud, and the lead paramedic changed the entire treatment protocol on the spot based on what he heard. One paramedic later admitted quietly, and off the record, that the standard protocol they would have followed without Darius's notes likely would have cost at least 3 of the 12 their lives before reaching the hospital. Another guest, a soft-spoken pension fund manager named Walter Higgins, would later tell reporters that he remembered almost nothing from the collapse except a stranger's calm voice telling him to breathe slower, to stop fighting the air, that help was already on its way. It was a small detail, easy to overlook amid the larger drama of the night, but it stayed with several of the survivors long after the ambulances had gone. All 12 guests were loaded into ambulances and transported without a single fatality. The ballroom, moments earlier, filled with screaming and shattering glass, fell into a heavy, exhausted silence, and Darius stood alone among the overturned chairs, his uniform soaked through with sweat. The paramedic team leader turned back before leaving, studying Darius's face for a long moment, as though trying to place a memory. He said the name Whitmore aloud, almost to himself, and Darius did not answer. He simply pulled his gloves back on, wiped the spoon a second time with a fresh corner of the towel, and pressed the fabric gently against his own tongue. An old field habit he had not performed in years, and one that made the young server standing nearby recoil in disgust. It confirmed what his instincts had already told him, a faint bitterness beneath the cream sauce that had no business being there, something that did not belong to garlic or butter or any ingredient a kitchen this careful would ever use on purpose. He folded the towel, tucked it into his apron pocket as evidence, and started moving before Rebecca's guards had even finished crossing the kitchen floor toward him. The man's voice dropped lower, tinged with disbelief. As he admitted, he thought Darius had disappeared after Baltimore. Celeste caught the word Baltimore the instant it left the paramedic's mouth, and something in her expression shifted. Grant demanded that security detain Darius so police could question him properly, but Darius offered no resistance at all. Celeste told Grant to be quiet, her patience for him thinning by the second, and she turned to face Darius, directly asking him plainly who he really was. Darius answered with a single word, "Dishwasher," and Celeste's response came just as flatly, telling him that dishwashers did not count respiratory failure in seconds. Nolan, still catching his breath, pulled out his phone and began searching, and within minutes he found an old record buried under a name that had not surfaced publicly in years. Darius Whitmore, the record showed, had once served as a senior field analyst for the National Foodborne Emergency Response Network. He had never been a physician. He was something rarer, a specialist in tracing contamination sources and reading patterns of symptoms before laboratory results could confirm anything. Over 11 years, he had taken part in 43 investigations involving hotels, factories, and large public events, building a reputation. And 7 years earlier in Baltimore, a catastrophic incident had unfolded during a large conference, and Darius had raised the alarm early, well before there was hard laboratory evidence to support his warning. His superiors dismissed his concerns, unwilling to act without confirmed test results, and dozens of people ended up hospitalized before the truth caught up with his warning. In the aftermath, the organization searched for someone to blame, and internal reports were quietly altered to shift responsibility away from leadership and onto him instead. Darius was recast as a man who had overreacted, a liability rather than an asset, and the label followed him out of every room he tried to walk back into. He resigned soon after and vanished from the industry entirely, choosing silence over a fight he no longer believed he could win. For a while he drifted between cities, taking odd jobs that asked nothing of him beyond his hands and his time work, where nobody would ever again question his judgment or demand proof for something he had simply known to be true. Chicago had been an accident more than a destination. A place he landed because a distant cousin offered him a spare room, and the Bellwether Grand happened to be hiring dish staff the same week he arrived. He had told himself the work was temporary, a place to disappear while he figured out what came next. But the months had quietly stretched into years, without him ever quite deciding to leave. Celeste asked him gently, for the first time all night, why a man with his history would spend his days washing plates in a hotel basement. Darius told her that dirty plates never asked him to prove what he had already seen. For a moment, Celeste had no response ready, something that almost never happened to her in a negotiation or a crisis. But Darius made it clear the night was far from finished, insisting that the 12 guests who had collapsed were not chosen by accident. He studied the abandoned seating chart, still resting on a nearby table, tracing the arrangement with his eyes, and said quietly that someone had known exactly where those 12 people would be sitting. Darius asked for the original seating arrangement, and Rebecca produced the chart from the hotel's planning system without hesitation. Celeste noticed almost immediately that the layout had been altered roughly 2 hours before the dinner began. Guests shuffled from their original assignments into a new configuration. Grant insisted that last-minute seating changes were routine and meant nothing on their own. Darius asked, who had authorized the specific change, and Rebecca pulled up the approval log on her tablet. The account responsible for the edit belonged to Grant's own office, a detail that landed heavily in the silence that followed. Grant denied it immediately, his voice rising with an edge of panic that had not been there moments earlier, and Celeste's expression hardened as suspicion crept into her thoughts for the first time. Darius refused to draw conclusions too quickly, choosing instead to lay out what the 12 affected guests actually had in common. Every one of them held either a board seat or an advisory role with voting power over the merger with Crowley Agricultural Holdings. 9 of the 12 had previously expressed concerns, some public and some private, about entering into business with Vincent Crowley's company. If those 9 were absent from the following morning's vote, the merger could pass easily, using the remaining votes still in the room. Celeste realized with a jolt that she herself was the 13th name on that list, her seat placed directly at the center of the group that had collapsed. She asked the obvious question aloud, wondering why she alone had not gone down with the others. Darius reminded her plainly that he had pulled her away before she took the final bite. Celeste looked down at the spoon, still lying on the marble floor, understanding for the first time that Darius had not simply saved her from a case of poisoning. He may have saved her from being erased entirely from the company that bore her own name. Celeste asked how the poison could have been delivered to 12 specific people without touching anyone else at the same table. And Darius explained that the garnish had been distributed unevenly plated individually rather than served from a shared tray, which meant whoever tampered with it only needed access to a small number of plates, rather than the entire kitchen line. That single detail narrowed the list of possible culprits considerably, since only a handful of staff members ever handled plating that close to service. Rebecca pulled the shift schedule cross, referencing it against the seating chart, and the overlap between the two lists made her stomach turn. Celeste stood quietly absorbing the shape of a conspiracy that had been assembled with far more precision than a random act of sabotage. Grant tried to slip out of the ballroom while attention was focused elsewhere, and Darius made no move to stop him. Celeste asked why he was letting Grant walk away so easily, and Darius answered that guilty men rarely fled, without unknowingly leading someone straight to the evidence they were trying to hide. He glanced toward a nearby security monitor as he spoke, watching Grant's figure moving with clear purpose toward the service corridor that led down into the kitchen. Celeste, Darius, and Rebecca made their way down to the kitchen level, together only to find that Grant had already slipped out through a staff exit and vanished from the camera's reach. The security footage covered most of the kitchen from several angles, but one section remained conspicuously uncovered, the corner where the dish station stood. Rebecca admitted with visible embarrassment that the hotel had never prioritized surveillance in that part of the building. Darius told her, without any bitterness in his voice, that nobody ever watched the people who cleaned up after everyone else had gone home. That overlooked corner ironically became the key to everything that followed. For weeks, Darius had quietly noticed unusual delivery crates arriving at the loading dock, always on Thursday evenings, always labeled as cleaning supplies. The weight of those crates never matched what the labels claimed, a discrepancy small enough to ignore, unless someone made a habit of paying close attention to details nobody else cared about. Darius had never reported it, lacking any solid proof to justify the accusation. He walked to the storage area near the dish station and found that one of the crates was missing entirely. Checking the drain grates near the sinks, he discovered a small, torn piece of a shipping seal caught in the filter mesh. The batch code printed on the seal traced back to a logistics company, and Celeste recognized the name the instant she saw it. The company operated as a subsidiary of Crowley Agricultural Holdings, tying the missing crate directly to the very man Celeste had been preparing to sign a merger with only hours earlier. Darius asked Rebecca whether the loading dock kept a separate log for after-hours deliveries, since most large hotels maintained one purely for insurance purposes, even when nobody ever thought to check it. Rebecca confirmed that they did, and pulled the binder from a shelf near the security office, flipping through pages until she reached the current month. The after-hours log told a more damning story than the digital records ever could. listing exact arrival times, vehicle plates, and the name of whoever signed for each shipment in person. Darius ran his finger down the column of dates, stopping on 3 separate Thursday entries, spaced roughly 2 weeks apart. Rebecca pulled up the hotel's delivery logs, scrolling through recent entries until a signature appeared again and again beside the crate's shipment records. The name on every signature line belonged to Grant Mercer. Celeste stood in stunned silence, unable to reconcile the man on the page with the colleague who had stood beside her for 12 years. The same man who had helped her secure her position as chief executive in the first place. Darius warned her quietly not to confuse a long shared history with genuine loyalty, and the words struck a nerve that ran deeper than Celeste expected. Police were notified immediately, but Darius had already spotted something far more alarming buried in the footage. Grant had not carried the missing crate out of the building at all. Instead, he had walked directly toward the stairwell leading down to level B2, the same level that housed the hotel's backup generators and central ventilation controls. Darius studied the building schematics pinned near the security desk, his jaw tightening as the pieces fell into place. The dinner, he said quietly, had never been Grant's only plan for the night. Darius and Celeste descended to level B2 together, leaving Rebecca upstairs to coordinate with the arriving police officers. Celeste insisted on accompanying him, despite his clear reluctance to let her come along. She told him that he had saved her life, and that she deserved to understand exactly why someone wanted to end it. Down in the mechanical level, they found Grant hunched over a terminal, frantically attempting to erase the digital logs connected to the hotel's ventilation system. He no longer bothered maintaining the pretense of innocence once he realized he had been caught. Grant admitted that he had been secretly working alongside Vincent Crowley, though he was careful to note that Crowley himself had no knowledge of the full extent of his scheme. Grant's true plan had been to trigger a mass medical incident significant enough to delay the following morning's vote entirely. During that window of chaos and uncertainty, he intended to invoke an emergency governance clause buried deep within the company's bylaws. Under that clause, Celeste would be temporarily removed from her operating authority due to what the documents vaguely termed incapacity. Grant would then assume the role of acting chief executive, granting him the power to push the merger through without her consent. Darius's intervention earlier that evening had thrown his entire timeline into disarray, forcing him into this desperate, unraveling moment in the basement. Grant sneered at Darius, revealing that he had read the old Baltimore file in full understanding precisely how that failure had once destroyed the very career Darius was now unofficially reprising. He reminded Darius that he had spent 7 years hiding from the world because no one had believed him the first time he tried to warn people of danger. Darius stood completely still, the accusation landing exactly where Grant intended it to land. For a moment, the hum of the generators seemed to grow louder, filling the silence between them, and Celeste watched something flicker across his face that she had not seen even when 12 bodies were falling around her upstairs. It was not fear exactly, but something closer to old grief, the kind that never fully leaves a person, no matter how many years pass or how far they run from it. Grant pressed further, telling Darius that the world had already decided who he was, and that no amount of heroics in a hotel basement would rewrite 7 years of silence. It was a cruel thing to say, and Grant clearly knew it, aiming the words like a blade meant to cut Darius off at the knees before he could finish what he started. Memories of Baltimore surfaced all at once. The sound of sirens, the sight of bodies falling, the altered reports, the endless meetings, where colleagues had labeled him hysterical rather than correct. Grant asked almost mockingly why Darius believed tonight would end any differently than that earlier disaster had. Darius turned toward Celeste instead of answering Grant directly. Celeste answered for him, saying simply that this time someone had actually listened. Grant lunged toward the terminal in a final attempt to trigger the deletion sequence before anyone could stop him. Darius recognized the command pattern flashing across the screen and cut power to the secondary system just in time to preserve the data. Police arrived moments later and took Grant into custody without further incident. Darius remained standing in the basement, afterward his hands trembling slightly. A reaction Celeste had never once seen from him throughout the entire chaotic night. She realized watching him in that quiet moment that this was the first time he had allowed any emotion to show through the composure he wore like armor. Celeste told him softly that Baltimore had not destroyed him. Darius looked at her for a long moment before answering that it had not destroyed him. No, but it had taught him exactly what silence cost. 3 days passed before the dust began to settle over what had happened at the Bellwether Grand. All 12 guests who had collapsed that night survived and were recovering steadily under close medical supervision. The investigation into Grant Mercer expanded quickly, uncovering charges that included conspiracy to cause bodily harm, tampering with critical safety systems, corporate fraud, and destruction of evidence. The $2.8 billion merger with Crowley Agricultural Holdings was suspended indefinitely, while regulators combed through every remaining detail of the arrangement. The board of Harrington Meridian Group pressed Celeste to hold a press conference to address the public fallout from the incident. Her communications advisors urged her to credit the hotel's internal safety systems for the successful outcome, believing that version of events would play more favorably with shareholders and the press. Celeste refused, outright unwilling to erase the one detail she considered most important. Standing before a room full of cameras and reporters, she spoke the name Darius Whitmore clearly and without hesitation. She told the truth as plainly as she knew how, explaining that a man everyone had been trained to overlook had recognized a danger that not a single executive in that ballroom had noticed. Reporters pressed her afterward, asking why a hotel employee with no formal medical training had been allowed anywhere near a medical emergency of that scale. And Celeste answered that formal training was not the same thing as genuine expertise, and that the industry, which once discarded him, had simply never bothered to look closely enough. The clip of her statement spread quickly through financial circles, and within days, other executives who had sat at that table began quietly reaching out to her, asking whether the man from the kitchen was available to consult on their own safety protocols. Celeste turned every one of those requests aside, for the time being telling each caller that Darius Whitmore did not belong to anyone until he decided otherwise. Darius did not attend the press conference himself, choosing instead to return quietly to the Bellwether Grand and take his familiar place at the sink. Rebecca approached him there, not long after, offering an apology that was far from polished or eloquent. It was not a perfect apology by any measure, but Darius accepted it anyway, understanding better than most people how difficult certain words could be to say aloud. Celeste appeared in the dish station soon after her expensive tailored suit, looking almost out of place amid the steam and the clatter of industrial machines. She handed him a contract, the position printed clearly at the top director of crisis pattern analysis for Harrington Meridian Group. Darius did not even open the folder to read the details inside. He told her plainly that he did not want another title attached to his name. Celeste replied that she did not need him to carry a title at all. What she needed, she said, was the man who had seen 12 people falling before the first body ever hit the floor. Darius said nothing in response, and Celeste set the contract down on the counter beside him, without pushing further, refusing to force his hand. Before she turned to leave, she paused and told him there was one more thing he needed to know about Baltimore. Darius turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. Celeste had already put her legal team to work reopening the sealed records from the Baltimore incident years earlier. Buried within the archive, they located the very first version of the original report, the one filed before anyone had a chance to touch it. That document carried a timestamp proving that Darius had issued his warning a full 47 minutes before the situation escalated into a full crisis. The version that had circulated publicly afterward had that timestamp quietly stripped away. Several former executives, it turned out, had deliberately altered the official record to shield themselves from accountability for ignoring his warning. Celeste handed Darius a copy of the recovered document, and he held it in his hands for a long moment without opening it. For 7 years, Darius had privately questioned whether he had truly seen the danger coming that day, or whether his mind had simply convinced him of a threat that was never really there. That uncertainty had followed him out of the industry, entirely settling into every quiet corner of the life he built afterward. When he finally read the timestamp printed on the page, he did not break down or weep openly. He simply sat down, his hands, the same hands that had washed thousands upon thousands of plates over the years, trembling faintly in his lap. Celeste did not offer him hollow words of comfort, and she did not remind him that she had believed in him from the start. She only sat across from him in silence, letting the moment exist without trying to fill it. Eventually, Darius asked her plainly why she had gone to such lengths to dig up the truth on his behalf. Celeste answered that he had given 12 people their futures back that night, and that somebody somewhere owed him his own past in return. Darius looked down at the contract, still resting on the counter, and finally agreed to sign it, though only under one condition of his own. He asked that Harrington Meridian Group build a system allowing employees at every level, even the lowest, to report potential dangers directly, without any manager standing in the way to silence or dismiss them. The program that emerged from that request eventually carried his own name, becoming known throughout the company as the Whitmore Protocol. In the weeks that followed, Grant's trial moved quickly through the courts, the evidence recovered from Level B2, leaving little room for his lawyers to maneuver. Vincent Crowley, cleared of direct involvement but deeply embarrassed by the scandal attached to his company's name, quietly withdrew from the merger negotiations altogether, choosing to protect what remained of his reputation rather than fight for a deal that had nearly cost 12 lives. Harrington Meridian's stock dipped briefly in the aftermath, but investors seemed to respect the transparency of Celeste's handling of the crisis more than they feared the scandal itself. Rebecca Sloan kept her position at the Bellwether Grand, though she made it a personal habit afterward to walk through the kitchen at least once, during every major event, a small gesture that the staff noticed and quietly appreciated. 6 months later, the program had already been implemented across 63 separate facilities under the Harrington Meridian banner. Darius still refused to wear a suit, preferring the simplicity of a plain button-down shirt, even in boardrooms full of tailored jackets. During one of the earliest training sessions, a young director raised her hand and asked him what he believed was the single most important principle of responding to a crisis. Darius looked out over the room full of faces, waiting for his answer, and for a moment his mind drifted back to that ballroom, to the silver spoon, to 12 people collapsing within 40 seconds of each other, and to a chief executive who had come within a single bite of never standing in front of them again. Danger rarely arrives with a warning, he told them. Sometimes it arrives on a silver plate, and the only person who sees it coming is the man nobody ever bothered to notice. The room stayed quiet after he finished speaking, the kind of silence that follows a truth people were not expecting to hear on an ordinary training afternoon. Somewhere near the front row, the young director who had asked the question wrote his answer down word for word, underlining it twice before closing her notebook. Darius stepped away from the podium without ceremony, the same way he once stepped away from a sink full of dishes at the end of a long shift, unhurried and entirely without need for applause. Celeste stood near the back of that room, watching him speak, a quiet smile settling across her face. On that terrible night, 12 guests had fallen around her, one after another, their bodies collapsing across a room built for celebration rather than crisis. But the man who saved every single one of them had never been seated at that table at all. He was the man the hotel had hired to wash the plates after the dinner was already over.